Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Lovely to see you all. My name is Paul Sherlock. I'm the Director for Brexit and North-South Cooperation here in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And it's just great to see you all here this evening. Thanks for joining us. My job is a very easy job this evening. It's just to welcome you all to Iveagh House. You know, for us who work in the building, you know, it's a real privilege to have this historic building as our headquarters, the building was gifted to the state in 1939, and the original house goes back to 1736, and this magnificent ballroom was completed in 1896. When John F. Kennedy was here on the state visit, this is where the state dinner took place, which I always think is quite small for something like that in some ways, but so huge history in this room. We're delighted to be able to meet again in person and really to extend a special welcome to members of the diplomatic corps here this evening and to colleagues from different walks of life and an interest in all things to do with Northern Ireland and North-South and the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. This evening we have the privilege to hear from Monica McWilliams in conversation with Áine Lawlor, where she will share perspectives and experiences of activism and of peacemaking. Monica, who continues to contribute to positive and lasting change for people from all communities across this island, is an inspiration to us all. The Department of Foreign Affairs is delighted to support Glencree with this event and with the wider programme of activities. Earlier this year, Glencree was designated as a strategic partner of our Reconciliation Fund, recognising the essential work that they do, both at community level and also at high level political engagement. I would like specifically to recognise the contribution of Barbara Walsh, who is soon stepping down as chair of the board of Glencree. Barbara has made an enormous contribution to Glencree over the years and has really brought her peace building and wealth of experience to that wider community of those involved in peace building initiatives. So thanks again for joining us. We're delighted to welcome you here to Iveagh House, and now I'll hand over to Niamh McInerney, CEO of Glencree. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, members of the Oireachtas and Diplomatic Corps, it gives me great pleasure this evening on behalf of the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation to welcome you all here to Iveagh House. On behalf of Glencree, I say a big word of thanks to our strategic partners, the Department of Foreign Affairs, who have provided us with this fantastic setting this evening. Particular thanks to Jennifer and Sarah and your team for all of the support with that. Tonight is a very special evening for us in Glencree because we've wanted for so long to honour a woman who has made such a unique and important contribution to her community, her profession, and ultimately to this island. That woman is Professor Monica McWilliams. Before getting into my remarks, I want to give apologies on behalf of the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, who is travelling this week and cannot be here, but offered his best wishes to Monica and the event, saying that her role and contribution to the talks process almost 25 years ago left a lasting and indelible impression on him and all who participated. Former Taoiseach Minister Mary Harney, who was the deputy leader of that government, also offered her regrets that she was unable to be here this evening, but wanted us to let Monica know how much her contribution to the talks process was appreciated and greatly valued by those who worked in government at that time. It is impossible in the course of an evening to adequately sum up the entirety of Monica's contribution to the peace process. From her early years, she was aware that Northern Ireland was a place apart and that very real tensions permeated the atmosphere between two uneasy communities. The late 1960s saw an explosion of those tensions onto the streets and ultimately led to 25 years of ferocious intercommunal violence, the effects of which are felt to this very day. Tonight is an opportunity to explore with Monica her motivations for getting into the often dangerous space of Northern Ireland politics and to look at how events on the ground during those dark days led her to conclude that her voice and the voices of others could play the kind of role she eventually did play in the Good Friday negotiations. We in Glencree have very good memories of members of the Women's Coalition participating in our political dialogue workshops that took place at our centre in Wicklow between 1994 and 2007. The Women's Coalition were regular attendees, bringing a unique and otherwise unheard perspectives into our discussions in the period when the ceasefire broke down in 1996 and then in the run-up to the agreement of 1998. Any fair assessment of Monica's contribution to the politics and public life of Northern Ireland would have to be anchored in her sense of duty and public service, a role model for women everywhere wishing to get into the arena and to make a contribution to social change, addressing economic injustice, human rights. And yet Monica is larger than this because she exemplifies the very essence of what it is to be an active citizen, offering public service to her community regardless of gender. What is so astonishing to all of us on this part of the island is that when you read Monica's memoir, she met all of the challenges in communities, whether they be in the fields of housing availability, women suffering from domestic violence or educational underattainment, against the grim and daily reality of ongoing violence against many of the people she was working with. In a normal, some might say benign political environment, many organisations find these challenges and the bureaucracy around them daunting, yet she worked through all of this in a war zone, often with the cost of great personal sacrifice. One cannot talk about Monica without referencing the quality of courage to, as she says, stand up and speak out. The American poet laureate Robert Frost wrote, "Courage is the human virtue that counts most. Courage to act on limited knowledge and insufficient evidence. That's all any of us have." When we consider the dark days of the Troubles with no sense of how it would end and no certainty that people would want it to end, Monica jumped into the arena, demanding nothing more than an equitable solution to the issue of broken relationships in Northern Ireland and between the two islands of Ireland and Britain. Along with the other women who got elected to the Northern Ireland Forum in 1996, Monica and her colleagues were met with everything from insult to derision, the price, some would say, of putting one's head above the parapet. Yet here, she and the other members of the Women's Coalition were with the first real chance since the Sunningdale Agreement of 1974 to end the seemingly unbreakable cycle of violence of the previous 25 years. The talks were arduous and prolonged. They did, however, give us an agreement that has broadly held the peace for the past quarter century. To think that a small place like Northern Ireland could produce leaders of the calibre, courage and tenacity of Monica McWilliams is something we should all reflect on with gratitude. You would expect that after a life of service and participation in the political arena, someone like Monica would have thought about retiring. Since the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, Monica has been the Chief Commissioner on the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, where she became involved in drafting advice to the British Government on a Bill of Rights. She's been an Oversight Commissioner on prison reform in Northern Ireland and was also part of a reporting panel to the Northern Ireland Executive looking at parliamentary disbandment in 2014. Today, Monica serves as a Commissioner on the International Reporting Commission on Parliamentary Disbandment established by Intergovernmental Treaty. Finally, and before we begin, let me express a word of sincere thanks to Áine Lawlor of RTE for agreeing to be part of this evening's event. Áine is one of Ireland's best-known culture affairs broadcasters and was for many the first voice they heard in the morning as they drove to work through traffic around the country. Today, Áine continues to broadcast on radio news programmes as well as the flagship current affairs programme, The Week in Politics, each Sunday at noon. Now, without further ado, it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce Monica McWilliams in conversation with Áine Lawlor.
Journalists are supposed to be neutral, but all during the late 80s and early 90s and through to the late 90s, when I was spending a lot of time in Belfast, I have to confess that there were two people I really had time for, and I thought they were bringing something to the table. And we were saying, and one of them was David Irvine, and one of them was you. So that's why it's my pleasure and honour to be here tonight. And the other thing we were saying beforehand, when I was thinking about this interview, I remember for so many women in Northern Ireland when they got to vote for you, when they got to vote for the Women's Coalition. I think it was an experience like voting for Mary Robinson down here in that presidential election, because for so many people who'd felt unrecognised and out of place in that binary, sectarian, divided society, it was the first time they had anyone they really wanted to vote for and could vote for with a whole clean heart and enthusiasm. And I think it's so hard. You really had, if you weren't there, it's hard to remember just how much that mattered at the time. And I think we're all completely grateful forever. But it took a pandemic to get you to write a book.
It did, and I had been prevaricating for a long time Well, putting yourself out there is a very personal thing. And there were stories that I felt I needed to deal with very carefully. There were also stories that needed to be told. And it took 25 years from the peace agreement really to tell some of those stories. They couldn't be told at the time. We had promised each other that we would be confidential, and that no one would say what happened when we went outside the country. And that was right that we did that. But there comes a time when you have to call it out. And that time was this last few years. And there were personal things in the book as well that I felt were very important. And some of my own experiences. I found, Áine, the hardest part really was writing about the troubles, writing about the tragedies, because it brought it back. You tend to, well, you never forget it, but you tend to put it to one side and say, I have to get on with this, I have to move on. And yet I was moving back to those times. So it took me to sit down and be quiet and shut up as opposed to stand up. And COVID did that. And I was working for Trócaire, the Irish Aid Compassion, as it says, translated from Irish to English. And compassion is what we needed in different parts of the world. And I was traveling a lot and also working with Interpeace, and traveling to Colombia and to the Middle East and different parts of Africa. And of course the travel all stopped. And so you had to sit. And I pay tribute to my sister who's here tonight, because had she not fed me and nourished me and told me to sit down and get it done, it started out as a labour of love and it ended up as pure hard labour. So I have that to thank COVID for.
And you've a happy childhood, growing up in Kilrea. Family of 7, 5 children lived, 3 girls. What made you, and you were sparky, like you loved life. You wanted to engage with life from the beginning, didn't you?
Yeah, I think my mother would have said more than sparky in terms of it. I wanted to be more like my older sister who's here tonight. We're Irish twins, there's 11 months between us, and she was definitely the good sister. She did what was needed to be done, I did what I wanted. And I had to learn very early on that you don't always get to work like that. And so my mother was a great person, quietly, telling me and teaching me through her own example of what works. And likewise, my father, he was the talker, my mother was the listener. But he very early on knew what it must have been like for a young girl who was going to go out into the world, and he was the one who said, stand up for yourself. Mind you, as I say in the book, when I did stand up for myself, he didn't much like it because he was the parent that I was standing up to. But those were useful lessons, and they had great value system. We had a great family life on the farm, and I talk about that in the book and the values that they passed on, but also that community of Kilrea. It's sad to say that it was a very segregated community, Áine. There was the Protestant community and the Catholic community. There's no two ways about that. And we all knew that. There was 2 of everything. Chemists, dentists, when the town, and there were certainly more than 2 pubs, but everybody knew which shop to go into. And everybody knew where not to go into, even in a small village in rural Northern Ireland. But the neighbours still did come together at times, especially in this week, the 12th, when the haymaking would start. And I recall that in the book. But as soon as that was over, people went their own ways. And it was a very, very early experience of what living in a segregated society would be like.
And it's interesting because, you see this kind of very happy girl, and you see her begin, as civil rights campaign starts, the troubles start to impinge. Your own brother waiting for him to come home the day of Bloody Sunday, sectarian car crashes, friends and neighbours so it's impinging. So talk to me about how that, the consciousness of names.
Yeah, actually you've brought that car crash back to me. I had just passed my driving test, and I thought it was really great being able to drive down to Coleraine, where the university had been built, which it shouldn't have been. That was another indication of the discrimination, when it should have actually gone to Derry, as we now kind of accept. But I was glad it was in Coleraine, and I decided that my friend and I would drive there to learn a bit more about the French that we should have been studying at school. But you know why you go to the university? Because there's more boys at the university than there is at an all-girls convent school. So we had a reason. And on that night, someone followed me in a car behind. I could see that they were too close. And of course, being a young driver, I allowed them to drive alongside me. And then eventually they hit the car and put me over the ditch. I broke my collarbone. It was really frightening. We thought the car was upside down. We thought it was going to burn. And when someone, farmer came and got us out of the field, and my father came and took us home, and he got a phone call. And the phone call said, "Have you a scrap car for sale?" In other words, we purposely knew who you are, and we thought we'd try and kill your daughter tonight. And so it was extremely frightening at the age of 17, 18. And that story kind of fits in with us learning very early on in our lives to keep our heads down in a community like that. No one was ever got for it. And the same drivers that night had also hit a number of other cars. So you kind of got the sense of injustice. And I guess my parents were trying to keep us from being angry. And that's why my father at a very early age took us on those civil rights marches, because they were peaceful. But it taught me very early, at the age of 15 or 16, what happens when a state uses repressive apparatus to keep people who had been on a peaceful protest down. And it was a sandy beach, and we were not going to throw anything. And suddenly CS gas and rubber bullets came in our direction. And my friends were falling down around us. And we were still schoolgirls. The teacher asked us the following Monday, "Were you in your school uniform?" And I don't know to this day whether she was giving us a message, "You should not have been in those marches," or saying, "Imagine the army opening fire on schoolgirls." So that was the start. I cut my political teeth at those early years of teenage years, when you think, you know, that you have all the adrenaline in the world and that everything's going to change. And I genuinely believed that Northern Ireland was going to change, because we'd watched the United States and we'd watched the civil rights movement and the peaceful movement and raising the issue of rights. And we figured, well, you know, someone in the British government is going to hear that these rights are not impossible to address. And the delay kept going on. And by the time they introduced some of those reforms, it was too late. Violence had already broken out and never stopped for the following 30 years.
And that violence continues through your college years. But it's interesting as well the way you're responding to it, because it seems to me you're seeing it very much through the prism of, you know, the civil rights movement in the States and your experiences there, and that you were starting to look at this again not in the traditional binary Catholic Protestant way, but developing your own kind of politics around it. Yes.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a great believer in students having the opportunity to get outside of their own country. I mean, I'd say in the book it was an unfortunate reason that I left. My boyfriend had been murdered in 1974 whilst I was a student. A dreadful, dreadful murder during the Ulster Worker Council strike. And in those days and Sunday nights when you lived in the country, you hitchhiked because there wasn't much public transport. And he got a lift with someone, and we're only finding out now the circumstances of his death. We're discovering more and more about how he was tortured before he had 4 bullets put through his head and his body was dumped on the student playground, play fields where he and I would have met often. And that was the reason why I thought, I have to get out of here. This is never going to change. This is just going on and on and on. And I won that scholarship to Michigan, to Ann Arbor. And it was the best thing that could have happened, because it gave me time to reflect. But then I also saw, right in the centre of Detroit, that it also had serious problems. And so where Belfast was famous for sectarianism, Detroit was famous for racism. And I was a student of an African-American professor. Because I came from Belfast, he allowed me to join his all-black class because he said, "You're one of us now," which pulled me up short, but it was great that he did allow me. And I went into the grassroots organisation of workers who were going through a redevelopment in inner city Detroit, which was so similar to what we were going through in Belfast, with the army having a look at the plans in Belfast and colouring in areas orange and green and deciding, having a big role in the planning of Belfast as it was being redeveloped. And I really got a great education there. I was thrown into the anti-apartheid movement. The Shah was being outed in Iran. Little did they know what was going to replace it. I say in the book that I joined their protests, and they had these brown paper bags over their heads, and they cut slits for their eyes so they could see where they were walking through Ann Arbor, through this big university town. And all I could think about was, why didn't we have that when we were in the civil rights marches? That would have helped. But they probably would have found some way of saying that was illegal as well, because those marches, the helicopters used to shout down with their loudspeakers at us when we were marching, "This is an illegal march." And we used to shout back, "Please keep the lights on, because that's the only way we can see our way home." I mean, you laughed at how extraordinary these things were happening. I came back from the States a changed person, and what I watched in the States was the troubles at home. And I don't know if any of you, and I see some of you here tonight, from other countries where there is conflict. And it's a very hard place to be when you're out of your own country and you're watching the television and seeing your own country burn down around you, as probably you see from Poland into Ukraine. And you think, I need to go home, I need to contribute. I've now had 6 years of education, and it's time to see what I can go back to. And I went back learning as much from the extracurriculum activities, of seeing a global perspective, and brought back a lot of learning with me. And I had the opportunity to address the United States Congress. I was 23 years of age, and somebody had heard me speaking about unemployment in Northern Ireland and about the rights of the people who couldn't find jobs. And I was asked to come. Jimmy Carter, who I think is a great hero of mine, President Jimmy Carter, had taken a great interest in Ireland, and he had set up this committee in the Congress, and I went to address it, this person who had heard me speaking in Detroit. And I pinched myself as I stood and looked up at the Capitol building, thinking, I was a tourist as a student. I drove past here, and today I'm sitting giving evidence to a congressional committee. So I came home really a much more mature person. That's why I say today I'm a great believer in students having the opportunity to exchange. And that's why I'm so sad about Brexit, because we had Erasmus and our students moved all the time between European countries, and that's gone. And there's another example. It broadens our minds. And I also say to our young ones who are immigrating today, that's fine. We still have too many leaving our country in Northern Ireland because of the lack of jobs. But come back someday and help us to get this peace process moved, because a brain drain is not a good thing in any country.
Before we move on to your return to Northern Ireland, there's a little bit of name dropping in the book. You relate, Charlie Haughey was your cousin, and by the way, Liam Neeson. Hello.
Yeah. Two good-looking men. Yeah, Charlie was my aunt. Is my father's sister, and was born in County Derry, where we're from. And when I was writing the book, Áine, I started to look into where they'd moved to. And then that was the time of the War of Independence, and then the Civil War. And in Northern Ireland, different things were happening at that period, exactly 100 years ago, this week actually. Times were really bad in Northern Ireland, and some people describe it as a pogrom. And what I didn't know was how active my relatives, including my aunt, was in Cumann na Ban, and how my uncle was an active combatant in the IRA. And on my mother's side, that was my father's side, on my mother's side, her first cousins were General Dan McKenna and Colonel John McKenna of the Irish Army. Michael Collins came north and took them, realising that if they were caught by the Black and Tans, as we now know they were, and their houses were shot up, that they were going to be killed. And he took them to the south, and they progressed the Hockey family through the Irish Army. And today my cousin is a TD, Sean Hockey, sitting right here. And we're very proud of you, Sean, and hope that tradition carries on in the Irish Parliament. And my other cousin's home from New York, also from Sean Hockey's family. So there's that connection. As I say in the book, we had 86 first cousins. So it was little wonder that I got elected for the Women's Coalition. And then, of course, Liam Neeson gets a few sentences. He was a very brilliant actor, but a very poor person, as good actors, as anyone knows if they go into that profession. But he had his eye on bigger things. He had his eye on Broadway, and he succeeded in getting there. So he gets a few sentences in the book, and my kind of pride, though I'm not sure how Liam would see it, was that I finished with Liam. I was so focused on being a good student, and he was so focused on having a good time after the theatre was over, that I thought, right, let's break here for a little while till I get these exams finished. I wonder would I make that mistake again?
Well, we're glad you did. Put it that way, we're glad you did. So you come back to Northern Ireland, you move into academia, you get married, you're rearing 2 sons, and you choose the trade union movement and the burgeoning women's rights movement for your social activism. It must have been really hard trying to do stuff so positive, because the 80s, it's the background, the hunger strikes, the long war, the bitter stalemate, the constant failed political initiatives.
Yeah.
So talk to me about those contrasts.
Well, again, there was a great deal of learning, both in the trade union movement and the women's movement. The trade union movement was fighting hard to be anti-sectarian, as I say in the book, not just non-sectarian. It was Angela Davis who gave me that thinking when she came from the civil rights movement to Northern Ireland at our invitation, and said, it's better to be anti-racist than non-racist. And we were struggling in the trade union movement to get anti-sectarian movement, a large anti-sectarian movement, to be part of the peace process. And Eileen Weir, who joined me in those days, if you remember, Eileen, it's a long time ago, and you were working on the factory floor at the time, and you were shop steward, and came from a different tradition, Protestant working class tradition, and today works in the Women's Centre in the Shankill. And was as brave then as she is today. And it's well known that, Eileen, you receive death threats today as a result of the strong stand that you're currently taking in your own community on the Shankill, saying that we need to settle down this rhetoric over Brexit and over the protocol. And as a result of you having such a strong voice, as you did all those years in the trade union movement, you get these death threats. And you still continue to stand up and speak out. So I want to pay tribute to women like Eileen. and your other friends who've come down today, who are associated with Glencree. And at this stage, I want to thank Glencree for that's also another movement that's really bringing people together, north and south. But that was how both the trade union movement and the women's movement. Now, the trade union movement, a bit like the civil rights movement, was very male-dominated. And we wanted to break a little of that down and say, look, women have a role to play here in decision-making as well. So we formed our own women's committee, and we stood up on very strong issues like strip searching, which was a very difficult issue in terms of getting cross-community support, strip searching in the prison. And the problem was that Republicans, in particular, Sinn Féin, were making it their issue. And what the trade union movement did was make it a human rights issue, and said that it's unfair to treat women in prison using power and control over their bodies. And particularly as a woman, I say in the book, went through a Catholic convent school education. Your body was something that you did not expose in any way, and it was used in our own conflict in too many ways as a way of using and disempowering women. So the trade union movement tackled that issue, and we actually won motions of support for that. And so we came through those difficult times, but they were very weary times as well, because you were attacked by all sides at times, and likewise the women's movement. I mean, the women's movement tried hard to be, and people in other conflicts say this to me, how do you get women to get consensus when we come from such different backgrounds on such tough issues? And so we used human rights, inclusion, equality, to build that consensus. And that, again, is where we cut our teeth for the Women's Coalition. And it wasn't easy. There was lots of factionalising, and the men used to, laugh as if they were ever able to be one big homogenous group. They'd say, oh, gee, look at those women, they can't agree on anything. And in fact, we were agreeing on many things.
And it's funny, again, it's hard to grasp now, but the way that there was the Troubles brought a kind of a hard man culture to politics, and women's voices weren't welcome because this was, tough politics. And so how did you manage to get a space for women in that culture?
It came very fast, and that's the other lesson I say to Áine and others who are working in the area of conflict resolution, is prepare, because you do not know when that day may come, when that constitutional moment finally arrives. And likewise, that message is for a shared island and for everything else, is prepare, talk, discuss, find out what people from other sides are thinking about this. And that's what the Women's Coalition eventually, when the Downing Street Declaration happened, Sir Patrick Mayhew was the Secretary of State, and it was his wife. And people find this strange, that it was a conservative woman who called us together and said, look, I'd love to hear the women's side of the response to the Downing Street Declaration and the framework document. And so it was my task to go out and call a public meeting, which I did in a rural area. I had no idea if anyone would show up. We took buses, we got the creche, childcare, we got everything in place, and hundreds turned up in terms of calling women as a call to action. Do you want your voice to be heard? There's going to be a change in Northern Ireland. Perhaps women's time has come to be at the table. This was before UN Resolution 1325. It was a huge risk. And I actually was given the task of writing back to Baroness Jean Denton and to Lady Mayhew, you're not welcome at this conference, which was a tough letter to write. And the reason why I had to write it was because many of those from a Republican nationalist side said, no, that's the establishment, that's the state, they have their fingers all over this, we won't be coming to this conference. So I wrote to them and said, I think it's best that you stand back and let us run it, and let as many from the divisions come to it and speak openly and speak their mind. And that was the formation, little did we know it, that day in Draperstown, the formation of the Women's Coalition. We called it Politics and Action and the Way Forward for Women. And about 6 months later, the peace talks were declared, and we said, should we go to this table? But first we wrote, in the book I say, we wrote to the parties, asking them how many women they were going to put at the table, and they didn't answer the letters. And we thought, right, we'll show them, we'll get organised ourselves, not thinking in a million years, Áine, that we would actually get elected. It was a kind of vanguard action to try and put pressure on them. But women were such, a non-entity. We were not a priority in terms of decision-making roles. And they didn't even consider it, even though the framework document and the declaration said the parity of esteem, pluralism, fair representation, but they were only thinking of religion. And so we said, look, gender somewhere and women's voices somewhere, it needs to come into that. We had 6 weeks to get together. We didn't actually think that we should form a party. That's why we called it a coalition. And we sent the message out around the newspapers. May Blood paid for the advertisement. Another great woman, as Áine knows, from the Shankill, who had also been in the trade union movement with us, and the response was phenomenal. So we thought there is a rising up here, and we have to go with it.
So you did win a place for women's voices in those talks, but the sexism, it was so blatant. And then the other thing, though, that you were bringing It wasn't just diversity for women, and you were insisting on diversity within the composition of the negotiators.
Yeah, it was blatant, and we should have expected it. But whoever prepares you for misogyny? And, we thought, why are they doing this to us? I think it was because we were coming from both sides with a different message. And because we had written on our posters, "Wave goodbye to dinosaurs," which wasn't the smartest poster in the world to have. And the story's well told about how the other politicians, particularly the unionist side, would say, "How dare you call us a dinosaur?" And we would say, "Is your name on that poster?" "Well, why are you self-identifying as a dinosaur?" Yeah. And other parties said, "You're a novelty, you're a cult, you'll grow in and disappear. The good housewives of Northern Ireland know their place," the famous Peter Robinson statement. I think they'd all regret saying that now. But remember, this was 27, 28 years ago. Maybe I would love to ask them, would they say it now? Well, they wouldn't publicly say it. They were caught on TV saying it, because that's the other thing about the book. I had to be very careful about what I put in that book in case I would get sued. And so I had to take everything off the record. So I went back and looked at all the newspapers and the documents to make sure I wasn't going to end up in court. Because believe me, I've ended up in court a few times as a result of calling out certain actions. And the misogyny could have worn us down. But what saves, I think, us, and it was our humour. We used good humour. So when we were told to go home and stand by the good men of Ulster, we got up and sang "Stand By Your Man." And the speaker couldn't believe that, and I'm not a very good singer, but the speaker thought that that was probably the best way to calm some of the insults. And we had an insult of the week notice board. I wish I had kept that notice board. And we wrote the time and the insult and the person who said it, and it worked. And this was before the Me Too movement or the people calling it out. And some of those gentlemen came forward and said, "Would you please take our name off that notice board?" And we would say, "Well, have you promised to behave differently from now on?" And it did make a difference. Hillary Clinton also made a difference.
Yeah, her support was really important, wasn't it?
She called it out, and and when we went to the White House each St. Patrick's Day, and she had been reading what was being said about us, and she said, "I'm going to speak tonight in the White House," and she applauded what we were doing. And actually, many of the politicians in the room thought we had bribed her to say what she was saying, because she was so powerful and so strong that women had, and this is back in 1996, 97, she made the point that women had their place at the table. I mean, the things they were saying was, go home and have babies, and the only table you should be at is the one you're going to polish. You're the Greek chorus of women, all you're doing is repeating everything that everybody else is saying, when in fact we were bringing entirely new issues to the table. And the other thing, as Eileen will know, is that we spent most of the nights and weekends going around the country, telling people what was in the talks and how they needed to be able to understand the reason that we had to be at the table and to keep on moving. When we first went in, people said, "You've got blood on your hands, that you're going to just become another party like all the rest of them. And that's a disaster for us in civil society." And we said, no, civil society needs to have its place at the table, because the community's voice needs to be represented in this. And, I pay credit to the politicians who had been around for years. But what we were seeing was a very different Northern Ireland. And that's the voice we brought to the table.
The photograph here, it's interesting. So this is one of the St. Patrick's Days in the White House. Liz, you were there, and Mo Molan, and you were there, Monica, and an awful lot of men.
Yes.
An awful lot of men in suits. And then underneath there's Mo Molan with your executive. That looks like old politics, and that looks like new politics.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. And Liz O'Donnell's here, and I want to pay tribute to Liz. The year before it was Nora Owen, and Tim O'Connor will remember when Nora Owen sat at the table, and all they ever commented on was her green suit, the colour of her suit. I think Nora said, "I'll put on an orange one next week." I mean, the country was burning down around us, and the comments were about what we were wearing. So I felt like it was a breath of fresh air when Liz came in representing the Irish government. I was very close to Nora as well. But you came in, and with your kind of feisty attitude of coming down to speak to us, because we felt like outsiders. We were a small group called the Women's Coalition where we were dealing with big parties here, and we were now inside. And Liz made us feel very welcome and as if we belonged, and Mo Mowlam did the same. And the day Mo walked in as a British Secretary of State, and remember we'd been accustomed to dealing with British Secretaries of State and officials, Mo just parted off from the table, walked down the side of the room and gave us all a big hug. And the men all stood back going, oh, she is breaking every rule and protocol that could possibly exist. She's either showing favouritism or who are these, women, are they in her pocket? And I kind of had to say to Mo at times, don't come too close to us because they're thinking we're only going to give whatever you're telling us to say. So we had to be careful. And the reason
the
why
one
I
as well
wrote
where
it-
you used to meet her in the bathroom
Oh,
when the
yeah.
officials didn't want you to be talking to her too much.
They felt that Mo was too close to us at times. But just let me finish that point, that I wrote it because I wanted women to be written back in. And Senator Mitchell came with Martha Pope from the United States. But I bet most of you don't know Martha Pope's name. And yet she was phenomenal. She was there every day. She was working outside the room. She'd go up to the Shankill and meet the people in the community centre in the Shankill. And she was putting the pieces together. But, she got written out. Likewise, I think Jonathan Powell was writing a lot from Tony Blair, the Prime Minister's side of the House. Almost at times I felt, boy, you'd think he had made the agreement all by himself. And yet I could see the role the Irish officials were playing, and Bertie and Liz, and I wanted to write their stories back in. I couldn't write all about the Irish officials, and I'm delighted that David Donoghue has written that story now. And again, Tim O'Connor and my friends, again, who came and sat down, Tim, with us in our little office and explained to us every day what was going on and reached out to the Loyalists. That was the most important thing. And I always thought, why aren't the British side of the House speaking more to the Loyalist groups, particularly since their union is so important? But it was the Irish government who was coming down, the officials coming down, and Liz and David Andrews and many of your other colleagues, who came, and David Irvine would say to me, I feel more welcomed by the Irish officials in the Irish government than I do by my own government. So again, it's, you know what? Relationships are everything. It's the chemistry that makes peace. And that's what I took away from that. And Mo, boy, was Mo something. I mean, in the book, I paint a picture of her on the last nights. Remember, we were negotiating for 3 days and 3 nights, and we were exhausted and hadn't gone home to sleep. And Mo appears with an intravenous drip. She had cancer and a tumour, brain tumour. Nobody knew if it was life-threatening. She had an intravenous drip in her arm. She was on her bare feet because she preferred, like myself, to run around these buildings fast on their bare feet. And she had no wig because it was bothering her and she wanted to be comfortable. And I was telling my cousins tonight that the thing I never forget was the male negotiators on the British side. No, on the union side, I'm sure they'd regret it now, but I don't know why they would say to me, could you tell the Secretary of State to put that wig on because we can't be negotiating with a bald-headed woman. Now just put that for a second. That was what I was supposed to do. And I said, the country's burning down round us and you're worried that she can't stand her wig. And I had to wear the wig at one time after I got cancer, and I know how uncomfortable it is. And she was perfectly right, but she was working herself into the ground that night. And to this day, I do not know whether she knew her life was limited and she was taking every risk she could, or she was just this incredible person who was exceptional as a minister, a Secretary of State, and I wish we had more of them today. She got Northern Ireland. The story that Áine wanted me to tell was how to get her. Well, this is also a lesson, Áine, you've probably seen it in other countries. It's not always in the plenary, and Tim will know this, it's not in the big plenary sessions that the serious negotiations take place. It's also in the side rooms, on the corridors, in quiet places. we actually used to send Pearl out to smoke. She was one of our smokers, because most of the rumours and stuff was all going on amongst the smokers. And she'd come in and tell us what was being dropped accidentally in terms of these exchanges. But we literally had to kidnap Mo on the final night because we were so concerned there wasn't going to be enough in the agreement about victims. Because normally it's armed groups that are at peace talks or the constitutional parties. The victims are rarely at the talks. And we felt we had to get something in, because I was working with Iveagh at the time, the victims group. But also, Tim, I want to pay tribute to you. You came into the room late that night on Holy Thursday night, and you said to us, you also had concerns. And I said, look, we cannot go to the people and ask them to vote for this peace agreement if they only read it as a terrorist charter. In other words, you're letting prisoners out, you're reforming the police. I could see it all stacking up on the unionist side about where they felt that we had given too much away on Republican nationalist side. And I thought, well, we need to get some words in here around victims, and you had brought my attention to it. And I turned someone over on the floor who had fallen asleep on top of my notes, where I had left my draft about victims. And I said, we need to get to Mo Mowlam quickly. And then it suddenly struck me, she has to go to the toilet at some stage, because she's a woman and we're the only women's toilet in this whole building. So then we planted someone in the toilet that night, and she whistled down the corridor when Mo appeared. And we rushed in and we said to Mo, look, it's not good enough just to have a statement in the agreement that Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, who was a very good man and was going to look at this issue on victims, but it would be read as a very one-sided attempt to be looking at victims. So we wrote about 4 sentences, and that's how we got those words in. Also, I think to this day, the words we got in victims, the words we got in women, integrated education, shared housing, resources for youth, community development, all that section, reconciliation, Tim, if you remember, people were so tired at that late hour that the right of women to full and equal political participation got squeezed in because I think nobody objected. And they felt, oh, let the women have that, and let them have perhaps this. And it turned out this soft part of peace building, those issues I've just mentioned, have become the most difficult, as you know today with this legacy legislation going through the House of Commons. We should have dealt with it back then, and we should have dealt with it more comprehensively. But Tim and I, who are now colleagues on the Independent Commission to disband paramilitaries, we talk at length about how and what we should have done. And I keep saying retrospect's a great person to have at the table. Because you could have said, let's put it in, and we did put. The Women's Coalition put in a commission for peace and justice. I found it in my notes when I was writing the book. And I thought, how did we let that go? Why did we not promote a commission on peace and justice, which was to deal with the legacy, and add it to the sentence on reparation? And it fell off the table. It fell off the table because, Liz, as you know, those last nights you were running around trying to get support for all these various proposals. And if we didn't have cross-community consensus and sufficiency of consensus for proposals, then they fail.
Yeah.
And so that's my story about Mo. And to this day, I am so relieved that we got those few words in on victims, because there might not have been anything in that peace agreement had we not succeeded at 3 o'clock on Holy Thursday night.
And so we come into Good Friday morning, and that's the morning when, as you say, the sun came out from behind the clouds. And such a fantastic morning it was. It really was. And then there was, it was days like this and Van Morrison songs and huge support north and south. But you then get into the grind of having to stand for election in your own right and having to turn all of these words, all of this language you'd worked so hard to get, into reality. And what that experience over those next few years was like.
I think Senator George Mitchell said some very powerful words on the night of Good Friday as we signed off and declared in favour of the agreement. I held up my hand and said, in favour of this agreement, probably the most powerful words at 5 o'clock on Good Friday. And he said, the hard work starts now. And I thought, oh, I've just been 2 years through sheer hard work and grind. And my own kids said the same that night. What have you just signed? When they put the reality of, is there going to be no parades, it's going to be riots, it's going to be killings, or they didn't say no parades, they meant more settled, and not the massive, terrible breakdown over the Glencree parade where the country was burned down. And I thought, yeah, I told my son that night, no, it doesn't mean any of that, we're still having to work on all those things. He said, well, what did you sign today, Mummy? And I thought, oh, there's reality, what did we sign? That's when I realised this implementation is going to be as difficult as the actual making of the agreement. And it turned out we were right, and Senator Mitchell was right to say that, because 25 years later, it's 25 years next year, as you know, from the peace agreement, a quarter of a century later, I would have to say I'm working as hard now as I did on Good Friday to try and keep it working, because of the clash of interpretations around what we'd signed, about the lack of support in the early years for those institutions which we set up. Again, Tim was involved in the North-South bodies. Does anybody hear about them today? And yet they're crucially important and need to be sustained. And the problems we've run into with Brexit. And I want to pay tribute to the Loyalists after the peace agreement was signed. Can you imagine how difficult it would be in working class areas of Northern Ireland to go out and support a peace agreement when you had someone like Paisley screaming that they were traitors, screaming that they had sold out, that no one should have anything to do with them. And they bravely stood up and faced that down. I tell in the book this story on the last night where Paisley invaded the peace talks. He broke in. It says a lot for our security when they let him in. And you remember this, when we all got really worried that he was taken over and he had brought us massive hordes. And I was doing an interview with CNN, and I thought it was in a tree house. That's how bad my memory was. I thought we'd climbed up a tree, but CNN had built scaffolding up the tree. And I had to go up on a rope ladder, and David Irvine was beside me. And he looked and he saw Paisley invading the mobile huts, and he thought the next thing happened. His own party was starting to fight, physically fight. And he reached for a rope like Tarzan, and he swung off the top of that tree and jumped right down and grabbed his own people out and said, whatever pictures go around the world tonight, there won't be pictures of our Loyalist party fighting with Paisley. This is a peace agreement that we're trying to make. The next thing I saw Pearl, and she was in amongst them, my colleague. And I thought, I can't swing in that rope. I'm going to have to go down the rope ladder properly and run and grab her and get her out. That was the nature of how tense the whole situation had become that last night. And the Loyalists played a blinder during that referendum. They went out night and day around their areas to tell people, you must vote yes. And as I say, it was easy. One word, no. You don't have to explain to anybody why you're saying no. You have to explain the agreement when you're saying yes. And people at every door that I knocked, and I knocked thousands, I had to say, this is what we have just signed. When so many lies and rumours, and actually it's a bit like Brexit at the minute. It's a bit like the protocol, the rumours that are going around, the fake news, the lack of facts about the protocol. It reminds me so much of that. And why I pay tribute to brave unionists and brave Loyalists and others in working class communities in particular who are standing up for their communities and saying, let's put the real facts on the table and let's see if we can work through this and get through this referendum. And we did. And we needed the unionist majority. It wouldn't have been good enough to have just had 50%. And so when the results came in and we were seeing that it was 2/3, the pictures, do you remember the pictures where I told the women to go up to the front when the declaration came in, that we had finally said yes. I said, run up to the front and throw your arms in the air so the pictures that go around the world will be the great happy ones of us smiling and not the pictures of Paisley growling. And those were the pictures that went round. And actually, I still remember the Loyalists walking out of that big building when the vote was over and being threatened and being told, we're coming after you. And they still stood their ground. So I'm very sorry that one of those parties, the UDP, didn't get elected. And I was, very, very sorry that they broke their ceasefire because they were back out into the cold. So my message to conflict resolution, pay attention to election systems. Pay attention, because the one that brings you into a peace table should be the inclusive one that keeps you working on the implementation. And so Tim and I today are working on the disbandment of paramilitaries, and particularly of the loyalists, who once again are feeling the cold and feeling threatened. But I still believe that the majority are going to stay in the path towards peace.
And then there's the whole business of going into the Assembly and having to redesignate to get David Trimble elected, because he's still under such pressure from Paisley, who hasn't brought his party into the peace process yet. Yeah. And again, we forget, you know, in all the work that you were trying to do to make what you had worked for so long, to make that real, again, it's against a background of Portadown and Holy Cross and the Quinn children. I mean, it was never easy for anyone who was trying, if you like, to walk the right path through
and
that.
the Oma bomb.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Quinn children, I broke my heart at that funeral. 3 little white coffins, burned to death in their home, all over the Glencree parade. And, you know, they were 2 of them were the same age as my 2 sons. And I remember I wrote for the Irish News when I came back from the funeral a very strong piece about sectarianism and how we had to keep working our way out of it. Because all I could think about in my heart was, how could I survive if my 2 sons had been burned in their beds last night as a result of some parade on top of a hill? And I actually did call Ian Paisley out, which again was quite a threatening thing for me to do. But you're right about the redesignation. I figured that was the day that we might lose the party, my own coalition, because the women in the coalition were so cross that we were, and we had discussed it at an open meeting, that we were going to redesignate as Unionists and Nationalists, because Trimble needed those votes. And our votes weren't counting because we were considered cross-community, or the other. In fact, we designated on the first day of the new Assembly as Nationalist Unionists and other, and the Speaker nearly threw us out because there was no such designation. And so we had to redesignate as inclusive other. And on that day, to get Trimble in, Jane agreed to become redesignated as a Unionist. I agreed to redesignate as a Nationalist. And Sean, you would find this funny if in the Oireachtas half the members turned up wearing pantomime donkey heads. They actually dressed up as donkeys to take a laugh that this was a pantomime, that we were trying to get the First Minister in. It was the DUP who were dressed up like this. I looked around, and this was the Parliament buildings, this was the Assembly. I looked around at my colleagues sitting to my left, and they were all wearing pantomime donkey heads. And this was a peace process. This was an attempt to establish a First Minister. We did succeed. The Alliance Party then also redesignated, and that's how Trimble became First Minister. And not much thanks we got for it, but it was more important. But I actually thought we were going to lose the party that day because our own members were so cross that we had stopped being Nationalist, Unionist and other. But I had figured out the rule. It was actually, I got a letter from Charlie Hockey saying, I wondered how long it was going to take you to do that, because somebody had worked out that that was the smart thing to do, but I didn't know. And we figured it out, and it was great to see a few commendations coming in that we'd actually worked out that the rule could be changed, and that 6 weeks later we could redesignate back to what we were. So people criticised us. But I said on the floor of the Assembly that day that it was better for the country than it is for the party. And if this is what we have to do, and if this is the end of the Women's Coalition, so be it. And to be honest, Áine, as you can probably guess from what I'm saying, we were kind of unusual politicians. We actually didn't care if we ever got elected again. We cared about implementing the peace process, and hence the reason why we ran to be members of that Assembly. But we actually cared more about the work we were doing in the community. And many of them were thirsting to get stuck back into that work.
And was it relief for you then in 2003, you know, the Women's Coalition is voted out, you go back, you know, and now you're working in the community and you also start developing your international work. Was it relief to leave Stormont behind?
Well, as anyone who's ever stood for election will know what a gunk it is not to get elected. But I had kind of predicted and prepared myself. The Assembly had collapsed. 4 times. And that was a bit of a threat to me too, because I was losing my job all the time. And I was wondering how I was going to maintain the mortgage, feed the family, as were others who were elected. And I figured the 4th time it collapsed, it wouldn't come back up again for a number of years, and it didn't. And so by 2003, I said to the women in the coalition, I don't think we're going to get through this election, because success breeds success. And it was that election that Sinn Féin rose and the DUP rose. And if that took it to make the next stage of the agreement, which everyone said it would, well, by then we were out of the picture. And I was relieved, because it's hard being a woman in public life in a conflicted society. And your life is not your own. You go shopping in a supermarket and somebody comes up and tells you that you're not doing the right thing, or you should do this. And I stopped taking holidays in Donegal, because everybody in Donegal had a solution to the Good Friday Agreement. And my holidays kept being ruined, because whether it was on the beach or in the pub having a bit of a good time singing, I just couldn't relax. So I felt going back into private life was a bit of a relief. But still, I was a political animal, and I don't believe you ever leave politics. But there's informal politics and there's formal politics. And I went back into the work in the community, into domestic violence research, was given great opportunity to continue that. And to me, that's as political. Changing legislation, working for changing policies. And the international work I absolutely loved, because I could see the perspective getting bigger as you go to Colombia and see their roller coaster and the things that we had got right, or the things that they had got right, and bringing those lessons back home to your own place. And that was a tremendous experience, and that's why I wanted to finish the book on a high note, having watched other conflict societies and realising, you know what, our peace agreement's still working. After all these others are breaking down, and you know, they're hitting big problems. The problems we have, I felt we could get over. And that came from visiting other really deep conflicted societies.
You're an absolute rock of strength. It's amazing to listen to you reading. Does anyone else want to? Yeah.
I'd like to ask you one thing I feel very strongly about, and that's sectarian education. When the Catholic bishops are asked about this every time, they say, oh, but we're very good at mixing, you know, we go to visit Protestant schools, or we do this, that, and the other. Do you think that the national schools in the island of Ireland were originally set up non-sectarian, and it happened they were started by various parish groups and so on, so they ended up being in various church categories, but it's not so relevant to the Republic, in political terms at least. But in Northern Ireland, it seems to me, even when you were trying to be a women's coalition, you had to put on your hat and for a short time and become a Republican nationalist or something, if you remember. Is there any way at all you could set up schools that are the same for everybody, even if you have separate religious education or something like that? I mean, many people nowadays are not religiously practicing. The ins and outs of Christianity are very similar now. Why on earth can't you get the schools together? Because still so many people never meet a Catholic till they go to college.
Well, the answer is that we do have them, but it's still only about 8%. The sad thing is it's the same percent as it was for the last 10 years. And quite a lot of that money came from the States, United States, who pay for people to start getting funded for the integrated schools. There are more and more of them. And shared education is what the government have been supporting, where they share the campuses. But I do believe that the day will come, and in the recent election and the programme for government in Northern Ireland, they have now adhered to what we wrote into the agreement, which was to start promoting integrated education. And the day will come when we will have that, there's no question. But it's been too slow, and it's another piece of the peace agreement that hasn't been implemented, genuinely and sincerely implemented, because there was too much adherence to the old status quo, and the status quo isn't working.
Yourself here, yes.
Monica, it's a wonderful pleasure and privilege to hear you here tonight, and I knew your story would be fascinating and that Áine would bring the best out of you. Just there, you talked about all these people of courage and the marvellous, marvellous women, and you've mentioned so many people that have been written out of the story. And we, in our group, you know, which we were started in '93, when we started going up, we were just amazed and gobsmacked at the amazing women, but also the men, and the courage and absolute courage that we don't have an idea of, that we saw in Glencree and in so many other places, and among Orange women that came down to Meath and changed their minds. You know, well, not deliberately, but that started to learn, and we all started to learn from them. And, you know, I don't feel, and I've never felt, that we in the South have done enough in terms of building relationships. I'm not saying about the government, and the Department of Foreign Affairs has done marvellous work in helping and facilitating so many groups, including loyalist groups, who have a great respect for foreign affairs. But in terms of ourselves, the ordinary individual, I remember when the referendum was held and people rang me the next day saying, you can shut up your tents now, you can go home, it's all done, it's over. And that was very much a Southern attitude. Well, we kept going until just a couple of years ago. But you brought up a lot of issues there, and I just want to go back to, you know, the soft issues that were neglected, that were left and that are still there, the legacy issues, the sectarianism, the reconciliation work, which needs to be really, really furthered in a much better and more wider way. But also, you mentioned about the current leadership in contest in Britain, about Brexit, about the protocol, and ironically, it's to save the Good Friday Agreement that they're putting this bill through the Parliament, which is bewildering, but it's also showing us how the gulf that is there. And you talked about pragmatism. How can we work towards that? Because none of those contenders look like they will budge on that legislation. Now, the hope would be that it would fall in the House of Lords, but I think there is such a gulf in the understanding, and we need to build that understanding as to what it is the DUP fear and what is down there that we can help with. But also, meanwhile, there was an election in Northern Ireland, and there is still no assembly even, no executive. So does that Good Friday Agreement need now to be reviewed and changed and reformed? And can that be done?
Okay, thank you. Well, there's a review written into the Good Friday Agreement. There always has been. But we have to be very careful about the unintended consequences of changing some of the main parts of that agreement. Remember, those who are most outspoken about saving the agreement never were supportive of the agreement in the first place. So you have to ask, what's the rationale for constantly saying we're here to protect the agreement? I mean, I'm looking at the people on the Conservative Party who actually spoke out against the agreement and still don't think it's a good agreement. And yet they're talking about saving the agreement. But all of what you said, you've answered your own questions. Yes, we have to continue doing that work. And there was a vacuum after the peace agreement was signed. And people didn't have the connections north and south. I remember in the trade union movement, we had much better connections those years than we had after the agreement. And people went into their silos. I often say that the best government officials, Irish government officials, they deserved to be made ambassadors in other countries, but they were the ones who signed our agreement and who knew it best too. And so there's a kind of memory that passes on of how difficult it was to make it. And it's time to pass the baton on to the next generation, but also to those in the South. It's really important that the South understands the difficulties in the North and not just say, God, those two tribes up there, they're at it again. Let them at it. It is much more complex. But I started the talk by saying the relationships are everything. And it's when you reach out, as I did, to discover my own peace talks, that the man responsible for the murder of my boyfriend was sitting next to me at the peace table. Not totally responsible, but in the party that did it. And there were people around that table who had done some awful things, but there was no point in saying, I'm never ever going to talk to these people. So at the end of the day, keep the dialogue going and make it as inclusive. And that's where I put my efforts now. I'm not elected, but civil society in Northern Ireland gives me great hope. And I hope civil society down here likewise, that it's pointing out, who are we talking to? Are we reaching out? I mean, how many people are coming to the North for their holidays? I don't know, but it's a good question.
Can we get a
and
microphone
that's
over
important.
here?
Very much. Thank you. Monica, my name is Geraldine Feeney. I'm a former member of Shanna there, and you're very, very welcome to Dublin. And I must say, it's a pleasure to see two very strong women in Dublin tonight. You did a great job, Áine. I've blown away by what I had heard. I knew quite a lot about you from my time in politics. I'd like your view on something very, very briefly, if I could. There's one party here in the South who are very keen to have a referendum on a united Ireland. Thankfully, other parties are more careful in their approach to it. Maybe now is not the right time to open that debate. Maybe that particular party I'm talking about would feel it is the right time to open the debate. Can I just ask you what you feel about it now? Is it the right time to debate it, or should it be left for another little while?
Well, it was always going to be debated. It's in the peace agreement. So ignoring any part of the agreement doesn't make sense. But you're right, timing is everything. As Tim and I know, sitting every day at those meetings and asking when is the time for paramilitaries to go away. And we ask, how long is a piece of string? And we're told every day, oh, the context isn't right, or the timing isn't right, either because of the legacy legislation or because of the protocol or whatever. So you can put this off forever. But of course it's been a debate since the day and hour we signed the agreement. And, you know, people came out and signed the agreement because they believed in the right to self-determination, and it's in the agreement. And people came out and reinterpreted part of the agreement as saying, oh no, there'll never be any changes. That it's there forever. Well, that isn't going to be the case. Otherwise, we would never have signed. We would never have got through the agreement. So the clashing interpretations has been a difficulty, but the referendum will come. The question is, when will the preparations be in place? When is the context? We have to get through the protocol. We've got a lot of pieces of the agreement still to work. I wrote the Charter of Rights with my commission for the island of Ireland. It's sitting gathering dust in the Oireachtas and the gathering dust in the Assembly. It was to ask the people and the elected representatives, unlike the Bill of Rights, which was meant to be legislated on in Westminster as a judicial document, the Charter's a declaration. I wrote that in 2011 and gave it across to the speakers in both houses, and it's never ever seen the light of day. And it was back then asking, what rights, if you move across the border, are you entitled to? Does it matter? And, you know, there are many things that are very different down here. Your inquest system is completely different and not as good as our inquest system in Northern Ireland. The coroners tend to be your local doctors. We wouldn't hear of having local doctors hearing coroners' inquest cases, which particular ones that are complicated. So there's things like that we ought to be discussing that were in the agreement and haven't been resolved. I also say the Bill of Rights would be a guarantee for the unionists now that we no longer can call anybody a minority. Bills of Rights in the United States and everywhere else when they were first drafted were the protection of the people against state authority and mainly minorities. Well, in Northern Ireland, demographics have changed so much that you can't even, you know, that idea that unionists should be against the Bill of Rights because of the old civil rights was for nationalists. All of that's gone out the window. And I believe it's a guarantee for unionists if there was a proper Bill of Rights in terms of recognising those rights. So those are the debates, that's what I'm saying. And now we have a shared island debate. And I think if it's really important that people no longer, and I absolutely think the best part of it is, that if there's any debates about unification of Ireland, it will not be through force. It'll be through talk and dialogue and inclusion. And that's, as we've learned now from the days of the peace agreement, is the only way forward. Yeah. So those who are pushing it, I have to say those who were pushing it, I take it you mean Sinn Féin, have been very quiet. Totally quiet about it. Makes total sense. They might not be so quiet down here, I don't know about the debates, but there's not a word said very much in Northern Ireland. And that's politics, because they realise they don't have to say much. And the other thing I'm told, and I don't know if Eileen would agree with this, is that unionists are now rethinking the whole thing in terms of, many of them are saying, for the same reason Sinn Féin are quiet and saying nothing, unionists are saying, well, you know what, we need to be talking about this, and we need to be talking about it in a sensible way.
I want to wrap up with a personal question, which, oh, sorry, Tim, yes, please, come on. And then
Sorry,
I'll come to
Áine.
that.
Here comes the expert.
Thank you very much. Tim O'Connor. I just, a lot of things, a lot to say, but I'll only be very brief because it's Monica's night. It's a wonderful evening to be here. I want to thank Áine as well for the superb. I think we should give Áine a round of applause as well for the superb job. And also Pat Hines and Niamh and everybody in Glencree and my old Department of Foreign Affairs. I'm a recovering member of this department where I spent nearly 30 years. I started my life as a young guy working in this beautiful room 2 or 3 years ago. But I'm here tonight because I want to be here with my friend, Monica, who is just an extra. And I suppose my phrase for Monica, and I speak, I think, now for all the former officials as well, maybe even some of the serving ones, is that my phrase for Monica is, she's a warrior for peace. That's what Monica McWilliams is. She's a warrior for peace. And she's indomitable. Her energy, her infectious enthusiasm for life, her kindness, her sense of humour as well. And by the way, Sean Haughey, it's great to be here with the Haughey clan. And I just want to say, I travelled here tonight with free transport. And I want to say thanks to the Haughey clan for that. Amazing people. 25 years ago, this time 25 years ago, it was my privilege to be working with Monica. I was an official, she was a politician. See Kieran O'Quinn here. We know, Kieran, the difference between being the public servants and the politicians. But we worked very well together and we had great respect for what Monica was bringing to the, and all what she was describing tonight. It was fascinating just to listen to it all and to hear the stories. But I suppose here we are 25 years later, and I happen to have the privilege of working with her right now, as she was saying, in this Independent Reporting Commission on Paramilitarism. And you're right, we never expected Monica 25 years later. But you said something, that's the business of peace building. And I want to say to you, we're so lucky and blessed in this island to have somebody of Monica's calibre, who is staying the course, who has the integrity and who has the wisdom. And one other thing that she has, and she shares with her wonderful sister Mary, she has extraordinary stamina for life, which is a very important little piece of the equation, because she's as indomitable today as she was 25 years ago, which is so whatever you're on, Monica, I'd like to please share
Definitely not.
I want, in addition to paying, and by the way, there is one thing every one of you here can do, if you haven't done so already, please, buy the book. Buy the book, okay? Because this is a very important book.
There you go.
And it needs to be bought. Monica, my just question to you is, as we continue the journey, and you look back on and kind of Áine asked the question as well, 25 years later, would it have made a difference if we had built into the agreement structures an implementation framework? Do you think that would have made, or is it just that life is life and no amount of tinkering with structure would have made a difference? I just wonder what your thought is on that. And thank you.
You know the answer. Absolutely, it would have made a difference and we should have done it. Absolutely. But you see, I believed that we had one and it turned out that we didn't. I remember going to, when Barbara de Bruyn was leading for the Sinn Féin delegation with David Trimble's delegation, she came into our office, it must have been the first 2 years of the Assembly, and said, look, you've got a proposal here. Senator Mitchell had come back, and you've got a proposal to set up an implementation validation. Because I believed we all needed to be back around the table, and Mo had been pushing for inclusivity, and she didn't get far because by then Peter Mandelson had come in and figured he could fix it by just having two big parties. It didn't work. And so the lesson I took from that was that we made a mistake by taking it off the table and saying, oh, okay, so you're saying you're getting on very well. Sometimes you're blindsided, sometimes you want to believe that, but still that institutional structure is so important. And I've learned a lot about having those institutional structures in place. I mean, Senator Mitchell used to get really frustrated with us, and he says, you set up an institution for everything. You've set up so many regulatory bodies, you're regulating yourselves out. And I said, Senator, we're living in a very conflicted society. Well, so's the United States, haven't said that at the minute. Yeah. And it's really important to have oversight, really important, and monitoring. And so an implementation validation committee would have been so important. And probably I would add to that, making it independent and international, as well as having people who had been familiar with what we had agreed. And somebody asked me, you asked me that question about reviewing the agreement. And I think it's not a concrete instrument, and it is dynamic, and it, of course, will change. But it's really important that a validation implementation committee looks at it carefully. We might not have been in the position of having just, it seems, two governments fighting it out, when in fact, if you had an implementation committee overseeing this, there could have been a third voice added to that. That's just my view. Third parties help in conflict. Sometimes you have to be weaned off them, as we know, when internationals take over completely from the local people. But sometimes, as I saw with the Patent Commission and many others on policing, it was really helped by good internationals coming in. And I have to say the United States played a really good role, as did the European Union, with that third-party view. And that really does help when you're so buried. As I said, it's not the best of expressions. When you spend all your time looking at your belly button and you can't look up from and get down and say, what does that look like from the balcony? And that's why, Tim, it's a long answer to your question, but I figured Tim knows the answer, because Tim has been around this so long, and this sounds like a mutual admiration society. But I tell you, if anybody's a warrior, it's that man sitting over there and this one sitting here.
And you know what, Tim, as a final word, I'm really glad you mentioned Mary, your sister Mary, who's here with you tonight. And also, you write in the book about you've both had journeys with cancer. I didn't realise you campaigned to get her septin brought in to save the lives of so many women in Northern Ireland, as it did here. But also, the one really sad thing I take away from the book, you contrast your cancer journey with your sister Nolene's journey through the mental health services.
Well, that was the saddest part of the story, to try and write that. And it's still very difficult to talk about it. We lost her sister to suicide. How many years ago? 2017. It's still very raw. And I say of my sister, who was a fantastic advocate, and myself, who had chaired the ad hoc committee on mental health in the first assembly, if we could not get the resources or the support that she needed, who could? And we couldn't. So I end the book by saying peace comes from the inside. And she never did find the peace that she needed, and struggled greatly. And sad to say, she felt she was all of us, which wasn't true. Her family would be better off without her. But, you know, we still talk about it, about what more could we have done? How could we have changed the system? And so I put it in the book, because I wanted that peace to be there, that you take on a few battles. And there was one that I battled, and Mary more than I, and struggled, and we did not succeed in keeping her alive. So we lost her. And it's a big, big issue in Northern Ireland, as I think it is in a lot of countries coming out of conflict, but not just coming out of conflict. They dealt with my cancer and saved my life, the National Health Service, and with Mary, and with my mother, and with my brothers. Cancer has gone right through our family. And along comes Nolene with what you mightn't think, and she was a nurse in the Royal all the years of the Troubles in the intensive care and in surgery. And she had resilience to keep going through that. But when she had her issues, there wasn't any talking therapies, there wasn't any treatment, there wasn't any, and all they did was give her pills and give her drugs, which made her decision-making go out the window. And that's my lesson, is really, if we get an opportunity to train practitioners, we really need to train them about what helps with mental health. But that's, you know, that's the sad part of the story, is that she's no longer. I say at her funeral that I hope she finds the peace that she never found on this earth.
But I think that's what made you so brilliant then and now, and hopefully for a long time into the future. It goes back to what they used to say in the States: the personal is political. And you know, in a society that was not willing to listen to the personal, and certainly not from women, that's been your battle your whole life.
Yeah. And I think too, what we saw was the lack of dignity that she had and got from people who should have known better. And so I say it's not always money. It is those basic little things about human dignity and listening, and particularly to people who care and love you, listen to them as well. So it was a very strong message, and it's also a message to our peace process, that you need to create a process that gives people some dignity and believes that they have some ownership of this process, that you don't take it away out of their hands. So give it back to the people.
I know. I know that's kind of a sad note to conclude on, but your relationship with your sisters as well as your husband and sons, it's so important in the book, and I think it really mattered to you to put that into the book as well.
Yeah, because in the book I say politics does take slices off your family, and anybody that's in politics knows how difficult it is to combine a political life or a community development activist's life, which never ceases night or day. And to combine that with hoping every day that you're doing right by your children, and that they don't turn around and say you were never there. In my case, I'm very glad that they don't. They haven't read the book. That's the book that I'm wanting. So they're not by any means convinced that what I did was, worth reading. But they will get around to it, like all boys. I shouldn't be so hard on the boys. I have no daughters. I wonder if I had, would she have read it? But that's it, Áine. You take the good parts and you take the hard parts and you get up again. And it has been a struggle, but it's been a worthwhile one. And I am very blessed. I'm very blessed to have a sister like Mary.
Absolutely. And all I can say is thank you. I've kept you talking for far too long. I just knew, and I could keep going for hours, but I won't. I've a programme to do in the morning anyway. So, we don't hear enough of that kind of humanity and courage in politics. It made such a difference. It makes such a difference. And thank you.
Thank you, Áine. And can I thank all of you for coming out on what my sister and I said. You've got the most beautiful climate down here compared to what we have. Another reason to come. But most importantly, thank you for your kindness and for your patience in sitting through this. As my sister often warns me, you can't even say hello in 5 minutes. So you're going to be answering these questions in such a long time that you take. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you. And to Department of Foreign Affairs and to Glencree, and particularly to my friend over here, Pat Hines, who made all this possible. And to Áine. Áine, you couldn't have been a better interviewer. Thank you for that.
Is her humility. For such an incredibly accomplished woman, a role model for generations after her, she never fails to exude such warmth, humour and grace. Your humanity, your steel backbone and your boundless courage have been and will continue to be a source of great inspiration to us all, Monica. I have no doubt that not only did you do right by your children, but you did right by all the children in Northern Ireland with the contribution you made. I hope you never retire and continue to inspire the younger generations to have the courage to stand up and make a difference. We need people like you now as much as we ever did. I encourage you all to go out and buy Monica's book. You are guaranteed a fascinating read. My thanks again to Monica for your generous contribution to the conversation tonight, to Áine for your wonderful interviewing, to our community political dialogue team in Glencree, to Pat and Terry and our wider Glencree team for your help in making tonight happen, to the DFA for your generosity in continuing not only to give us this beautiful venue tonight, but your belief in Glencree and your continuation in supporting us. We couldn't do what we do without you. And to all of you for being here, thank you for your engagement, your contribution. I think I have no doubt that, like me, you could listen to Monica all night. So thank you for that. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Lastly, I just want to say, just draw your attention to the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Friday bombings in Belfast on July the 21st, 1972. The events of that afternoon represented a pivotal moment for many of the people who went on to be founders of the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation, People like Uno Higgins O'Malley, John Kelly and Lady Eleanor Wicklow, who were seized by the idea that violence would only deepen the problems of a divided society and that what was needed was space for dialogue. John Kelly was a young bank official in Belfast that day and will be in Glencree this coming Sunday, July the 17th, to remember those events, including the period leading to and after that day. We'll also remember those people who perished in the explosions that afternoon 50 years ago. If anyone would like to attend the Glencree Circle conversation, which Jeffrey Curry is kindly facilitating on Sunday, please indicate it to any of the Glencree staff here this evening. We'd be delighted to have you, and we'll make the arrangements for you to attend. So it's this coming Sunday at 3:30 in the Barracks building in the Glencree Centre. Just lastly, thank you all again, and just to wish you a very safe and pleasant journey home. Thank you.